I know you tried something before the U.S. Supreme Court.
I lost pretty big before the Supreme Court.
Is there audio of that?
Oh, God, I hope not, but I think there probably.
Spoiler alert, there definitely is. For almost 40 years, Henry Martin has been a federal public defender here in Nashville. That makes him the longest-serving federal defender in the entire country. Pretty impressive when you consider these are 4-year terms. Henry's a 6th-generation Middle Tennessean whose grandfather arrived on the side of a horse-drawn wagon. He's also worked with some of the great legal minds of our city, and as you just heard, argued in front of the highest court in the land. Still, he's pretty down to earth, and just like me, he loves a good story. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. It's Banner & Company. You have done your job longer now than anyone else in the country, federal public defender. Did you think you would be a lifer?
No, not at all. I'd been in private practice about 10 years at the time I got the job I'm in now. And I enjoyed doing criminal defense work, but I needed to be better at it. And so I thought I would come and do maybe 1, maybe 2 terms, they're 4-year terms, and go back into private practice as a more skilled, more experienced lawyer. And I just have never looked back.
What happened in the 80s that sort of changed the focus of your office or the concentration of your work?
Kennedy family rewriting the criminal laws. During the 80s, they passed, well, one thing was the war on crime was probably the biggest change. And that was, Nixon kind of hinted at it, but Reagan went in it full bore. And the war on crime was nothing but a war on young black men. It started politically with Reagan and Bush and some others. I mean, the Democrats haven't been good on that. And then the Kennedy in the Senate sponsored a couple of bills that got passed that imposed, they led to the implementation of sentencing guidelines. And they restructured the whole sentencing process, which meant that people that we had represented before then who often got probation, never got probation. The probation is, I mean, nobody gets probation anymore. Everybody gets some lockup time. I mean, that I'm exaggerating. I mean, there are a few, but we used to, a lot of our clients never served a day. They would get arrested. We'd represent them. They'd either go to trial or plead, be put on probation, succeed on probation, never get in trouble again. But that doesn't happen now. The other thing, the big change that really had an impact on us was the Bail Reform Act, which I consider to be the Bail Repeal Act. We used to find out we had a new client when they'd walk in the door with some forms that Kent Sandage had given them when they had been taken before him for an initial appearance, and he had released them on their own recognizance, essentially with some conditions, and sent them across the street. We had one come in one time with his release forms that Judge Sandage signed, and then with a file folder that some lawyer in the courtroom told him to give to his lawyer across the street. That was Joe Brown, then he might have been an assistant U.S. attorney then. Mm-hmm. That was his file that he sent by way of the guy he was prosecuting over to give to our office. Mariah Wooten was the one that got it at the time. I mean, she opened it up and she saw it was Joe's original file. And so she called him, and he said, well, just, copy what you need and then get it back over to me. Well, those days are gone. I mean, the prosecutors who willingly will be that open don't exist anymore. Bail is non-existent almost, and probation's almost non-existent.
And we all remember the 3 strikes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was nationwide. I mean, that was states did it, and the feds followed through.
Let's talk a bit about some of your more notable cases. There was one in 1968 that happened here in Metro that would later, I think, lead to the person being on the most wanted list longer than any other individual in history.
From 1968 till 1986, I think. Charles Lee Heron was one of 4 people in a car that left at night from one of the dorm areas around TSU, with 4 guys who lived in the same area up around Cincinnati, 2 of whom we learned later had probably been involved in counterfeit American Express checks. And Metro Police had been investigating and thought they had narrowed the field down to who was doing it. And that night, so happened they were going to make an arrest. And so I think they saw some of the people get into the car and pull away from there and started following them, and wound up following them to a warehouse area over off of Charlotte. And this was late at night, and stopped behind them. I think by then they had the flashing lights on and their spotlight stuff on and stuff, and they were getting out of their cars. And as they were getting out of the cars, all of a sudden shots came towards them from the car that these 4 young men were in. Both officers were wounded. Both wound up dying. The 4 people got back into the car, left, and weren't seen for a while. At some point in time, they wound, and my memory's getting a little foggy on this, they wound up, I think one person turned himself in when he found out there were warrants out for him. And then another one was arrested maybe not too long after that. And then the one who had actually admitted to being the one who fired the shots from the car was getting ready to board a plane in New York for England or France or somewhere, but had called, because I think it was way before texting or email, called Nashville, and where they called the police or the DA's office or something, and said, "You got the wrong people." Said, "It was me." But they were already on his tail, and they got him at the airport. All were convicted, sentenced to life. It just so happened that George wound up representing one of them on habeas, and on the appeal of his habeas case, and I was clerking for him that year, and sent me out to show the guy the papers. And this was William Garrett Allen. Mm-hmm. This was the guy who admitted to firing the rifle. And so I showed him the papers and went on back. Well, maybe within 2 or 3 days, they walked away from the picnic grounds, all 3 of them, and escaped. And so the first person the FBI wanted to interview was the last person who was on the visitors list to see Mr. Allen. That was me. So I didn't know anything about the escape or anything. So anyway, they were gone for some period of time. One of them was either turned himself in or was arrested 8 or 10, 15 years later, quite a while later, in Baltimore, and the next morning was found hanging dead in his cell. And that word somehow spread through the community. And so my client, who had never been arrested, was living in Houston at the time. And so this would have been now about in the 1987, 1988. And somehow or another he heard about the guy who'd been arrested and died. And by then, somehow, William Garrett Allen had connected with him. I mean, my client had never been arrested. But the 2 of them were living together in Houston, and they decided, we got to move. There's somehow or another they're on to us. And so they headed to Florida. And when they got there, Allen went into the driver's license place to get a new license. And the teller or the attendant there at the desk recognized the name as being on a wanted list. And so they were arrested in Florida. And that was in 1988. And my client, and so then Heron was brought back to Nashville and charged with unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. And Bill Reddick and I go to see him. He has not been in Nashville since that night in 1968. He's not seen his mother since 1968 because he was on the run the entire time, and he's a little guy. FBI described him as armed and dangerous. Bill goes in and says, "Mr. Allen said, we're your lawyers. We're going to blow you out of this place." And little Charles Lee Heron was this little bitty guy. I think he was kind of taken aback by that. He wasn't armed and dangerous. He had been, when he left Nashville, he went to Atlanta. He stayed there for a year or two, maybe. He was working in housing projects, trying to set up alternative schools to teach kids African-American history and to teach the residents how to have little gardens in the area. He went from there to Houston, where he worked in an art frame shop. He was a vegetarian who rode a bicycle back and forth to work. He didn't have a gun. He didn't have a weapon. He never hurt anybody in his life. And so Bill and I represented him. We went to trial on the theory that he ran that night because he had to. The police were pulling blacks out of dorms, out of apartments, off the street. They arrested hundreds of blacks and took them downtown. We had a guy testify, and at the time of his testimony, he was a deputy commissioner of something in Pennsylvania, but he had been a student at Fisk at the time. They hauled him down there and were interrogating him, and he wasn't saying what they wanted to hear. He did, I don't know anything. And so a sergeant came in and slugged him, hit him in the side of the head, burst his eardrum. He was, at the time he testified, he still had limited hearing. I think it was on the left side of his head. That sergeant was Joe Casey, who at the time of the trial was chief of police for Metro. We were praying he was going to call Joe Casey and we'd get to cross-examine him, but they
didn't happen.
So,
if I recall correctly, too, in the media they were playing up that these were Black Panther activists.
Yeah, because it was a few weeks after Stokely Carmichael had been here, and weeks or months or something, and there'd been riots in the street, and the police had to come in. I was thinking the National Guard had to come in or something. I don't remember, but it was, the race relations were tense. But they billed it as these guys, they had been out demonstrating, and they'd been roughed up by the cops when they were doing it. So when they saw a police car behind them, and when they knew, two of them knew they'd been doing something wrong, they freaked out.
Yeah, the two counterfeiters had something to hide.
Yeah,
the other two guys were along for the ride.
Yeah. And I found out some later, and then much later on all of this, but William Garrett Allen's dad worked with my dad at DuPont, and they were friends, co-workers.
Really?
And my dad thought a lot of him. He was a really principled guy. William Garrett Allen then had a son who I found out, unbeknownst to either me or William Garrett Allen, that his son and my daughter were social friends. They were in different groups that would hang out together. Because Allen after he'd been brought back here, after he was captured, he served his time, made parole, and our office represented him in litigation. Then Sumter Camp represented him, and so Allen, I got to see him again for the first time since the jail cell so many years ago, after he made parole and came by the office. So,
but you had two dead police officers, which supercharged.
They tried the case of the dead white officer in 1968. They tried the case of the dead black officer in 1990.
It's Banner and Company. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. We'll be right back. If you're interested in building a more thriving and inclusive community by turning thoughtful generosity into positive change, well, you might want to know about one of our sponsors here at Banner and Company, the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. It matches compassionate givers with worthy causes in ways that benefit all of us. Check them out at cfmt.org. Madeline Murray O'Hare. You've got to talk about her.
She was close to the top of my list of favorite clients.
How did you meet her?
I started out in the installment building with $100 a month rent, and I would get clients who would give the Nashville Bar Association on the second or third floor $7.50. They would keep $2.50 and then send the guy with a check for $5 to a lawyer who'd agreed to take cases. I was right upstairs. So I got a lot of fun clients. One came in one day, his name was Harold Church, and he said, I'm an atheist. I'm a good atheist. I pay my bills. And I am the Tennessee president of the chapter of the Society of Separationists, Inc., doing business as American Atheists, and we need a lawyer. We want to sue the state of Tennessee because there's a clause in the state constitution that requires a religious oath. And, you have to swear an oath on, belief in God to be on the jury. So I've forgotten now exactly what it is. And I said, yeah, that sounds like fun. So it turns out they were also wanting to challenge similar clauses in some other states, I think Mississippi and Texas and maybe Arkansas. And they had problems with lawyers. And so Harold Church talked to Madeleine Murray O'Hare, who was headquartered in Austin, Texas, and she ran American Atheist. And so she hired me to represent them in their other jurisdictions. And so I flew down 2 or 3 times and met her, and she was really a very, very bright person, very damaged by the life that she had led. She was, she was prayer in schools, and even though there were other cases,
and the Pledge of Allegiance, wasn't she after the Pledge of Allegiance at one point?
She may have been, but I think it was the prayer in schools
Okay.
that was her primary source of notoriety and adverse attention. She was living in Baltimore at the time. She was arrested for violation of a law that related to tethering your horse on a downtown street because she was parked illegally. And they beat her up. The police beat her up because they recognized her because, her son was the named plaintiff in the school prayer case. And she was essentially chased out of Maryland and then wound up in Texas. And had been kind of hounded all of her life, regularly got death threats. And so she lived in a very closeted world. She had a son, and she adopted her other son's daughter. Actually, the son who was the named plaintiff became a fundamentalist Christian, and ran his own nationwide organization of Christians. And so she had his daughter and either 1 or 2 children of her own, and that was her world. Except for when they had conventions. And I went to several of her conventions while I was her attorney, and I spoke about First Amendment stuff. Their convention was in Denver one year, and her plan was, and she got a lot of threats. If you come to Denver, you're not going to leave. We're going to kill you. And so she staged an atheist march down the Legislative Mall that ran from the steps of the Capitol down, I guess, towards their Supreme Court building or something. She led it wearing a white gown, standing by herself, nobody else around her, so that if they shot her and killed her, it would be a dramatic picture of the red blood on this white gown. Well, nobody shot her, but that's the kind of life that she lived. That she loved the notoriety. She loved being a thorn in people's side, but she also realized she had no friends. She had, except for her family and the adoration of her group. But that was once a year or something. She called me after I'd become the defender and had been there maybe a year or so, and I'd kind of stayed in touch with her. And she told me she was scared, that she had a hard time hiring people. Because one thing, the adverse publicity they got, people didn't want to be there, and then there are also weird people who would be attracted there and just turn out to be good employees. She said, I've got a guy working here. I'm scared of him. I mean, there's things that he does that I just worry. I have a bad feeling about him. Turns out later, that was the last time I talked to her, and then I heard a few months later that she was dead. She'd been murdered. She and her family had all been murdered, and they had been kidnapped. And it was this guy. He'd kidnapped him. He'd held him hostage for 2 or 3 weeks, while he drove around emptying bank accounts, selling stuff from their house, holding them hostage. And then he took them up in north central Texas, in a place near Camp Wood where I've been. Killed them all and buried them. There's somebody else. He had a Confederate working with him, a co-actor, and some of my compatriots in the defender's office in Texas wound up representing him on federal charges because they'd traveled in interstate commerce, and kidnapping, of course, is a federal crime. But this guy that she was afraid of had, in fact, kidnapped and killed her and her family.
Now, I've heard that there's a special connection you have to the building you currently work out of. Tell me about that.
Well, the office that I'm in now was built by the Methodist Publishing House. They moved out some time ago. First, I think, to move down 8th Avenue, and then they moved out away from downtown. And then the state of Tennessee occupied it for a while. I think, UT Nashville was there for a little bit, and then it was vacant at the time that we moved into it. We had been right next door in a smaller building, and outgrew it and needed some additional space, and so the GSA, the government retail real estate agent that was working with me, said, "I got some property I want to show you." And so he got the keys to it. It had been, padlocked and emptied, nobody in there at the time. And we had to go through the basement. He didn't have keys even to the main doors. And I think the elevators might have been shut off, so we had to come up the stairs. He said most of the offices have been taken down to the walls, but I want to show you one part of one floor that you might like. And so we went up to the second floor and down to the end that faces onto Broadway. And when we get down there, all across that end of the building, which is like a large conference room here, large office here, and then open workspace in between, had ceilings higher than this with the molded plaster ceilings, real wood paneling, big heavy wooden doors, big windows. It was probably the executive suite of the Methodist Publishing Company when they were there. So I said, "Yep, I'll take it." And then I chose that one office there. We've got a library in the other. So I'd been there for a while, and my parents were still alive and living out in Madison, Tennessee. And I was out at their house visiting. I looked over on a coffee table, and there was a picture, and I recognized in the picture my grandmother, my father's mother. And the surroundings looked pretty interesting. And I knew that she had worked for the Methodist Publishing House. And I said, "That's my office." And so I borrowed the picture, and I since before they died, I got it back to him, but I had a copy of it made, and went down and compared with the real wood paneling, compared the wood grain in the paneling to from the picture. It was a good enough picture to the wood grain paneling in my office, and the picture was taken at a desk, which is where my desk sat at the time I did this. So I gathered the people. She's sitting there with actually I can show it to you. Sitting there with 4 of her
some coworkers.
So I got 4 of my coworkers, and I chose the 4 who were the 4 remaining from 1985 when I came, and were still there. And we gathered around my desk, and somebody took a picture, and then I mounted on my wall a picture of my 5 and of her 5, and it's still there. So I sit, it's like 2 feet from where I sit.
So you recreated
that scene with her there, and I since realized she probably died there or had a heart attack. She had a heart attack at work, and I was about 7 or 8, and I don't know whether she ever made it to the hospital or not.
It's Banner and Company. My guest is federal public defender Henry Martin. We'll be right back. I know you tried something before the U.S. Supreme Court.
I lost pretty big before the Supreme Court.
What was the case, and what was the experience like?
Both were. I wish I could do them over with what the resources we have now. The case was about the exciting issue of who decides how much jail credit a federal inmate gets. Is it the judge or is it the Bureau of Prisons? And we took the position that it was the judge, that the judge could award credit for pretrial time to an individual, because the judge was there in the place where the person was confined and knows why and how they were confined and so forth. The government took the position that the statute gives that responsibility to the Bureau of Prisons, and frankly, it does. But that was the issue before the Supreme Court, and they ruled 9-2 that the statute gives the Bureau of Prisons the authority to determine how much jail credit somebody gets.
Do you remember looking at any of them?
Oh, yeah. I was actually pretty calm. I shouldn't have been, because I wasn't as prepared as I would be now. We now have a really good preparation system. We put people, we get people to help them write the papers to get there, and to write the brief, and we moot.
You act it out.
Yeah. You act it out. So, and the people who are conducting those know the justices, know their proclivities, they know the law, They know the question is likely to be asked. And so they'll go through it, live, then they'll stop and go back and rehash it and digest it and stuff, and then do it again. When I went, I had gotten to know Alan Morrison, who is a lawyer who had done some consumers' interest litigation before the Supreme Court. He was the only Supreme Court lawyer I really knew that it was good. And he had come down and done some guideline stuff for us before the district bench. I got him to moot me the afternoon beforehand. That was my. Plus, I wrote the brief along with two lawyers in my office, and read all the cases, and tried to anticipate questions and stuff. But I was a babe in the woods compared to what I would be now. I wound up getting in an argument with one of the justices who was one of my two votes. So it just, I would have been so much better prepared. Probably would have, the outcome I think was the right outcome.
Yeah.
I think the law really did intend for the Bureau of Prisons to get the law should have been that the judge who's there where everything happens makes the decision.
But that wasn't the law.
But that wasn't the law.
Is there audio of that?
Oh, God, I hope not, but I think they're probably.
I think they keep audio of everything.
I've not gone to find out.
It's possible, Henry. We could dig it up.
You got to promise me you won't go.
We could dig it up.
If you play that.
We'll hear argument next in number 90-1745. Mr. Martin, we'll hear from you.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court, we do agree in this case as to what the issue is, and that is that this Court should determine what Congress intended for the determination of entitlement of jail credits under the new Act. I will, before I begin.
Mr. Martin, the problem doesn't lie with all that. The problem lies with what happens after the sentence is handed down. Are you going to talk about that?
Yes, ma'am. The next thing the Court would do would then determine the sentence and make a decision under our proposal whether or not the defendant had any prior jail credit that should come up.
I don't see how a judge right now can give you credit for all the time you have spent prior to the time the sentence commences. It's only the Attorney General that could possibly do that.
Just clear the reason that.
Why wouldn't it say for any time he will have spent? If they envisioned that, Mr. Martin, it's interesting how that might work and whatnot, but can we look at the text of the statute since we don't have any legislative history?
As originally introduced, did the bill contain this language?
I don't know that. The legislative history was the same for the original version, so I suspect that it was. I have not reviewed the prior versions except for the legislative history of the prior versions.
I guess we'll have to read the law.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed hearing that little bit of history. That was 1992, and the case was United States v. Wilson. You heard Henry interact with Chief Justice William Rehnquist, along with Justices Sandra Day O'Connor and Antonin Scalia. Okay, I know that you lost before the Supreme Court, but what has been your greatest legal victory?
Good golly.
If they were going to write the bio on you.
I'm not trying cases anymore, so I'm having to dig back in my memory. I'll tell you one, though, is the first death penalty case. It was a young man who had, along with his two brothers, were charged and convicted for burglarizing a drugstore in Cheatham County in the middle of the night. And a Cheatham County deputy came on the scene because the burglar alarm went off and was shot in the back by one of the three and died. And my client, when he was arrested, confessed to being the one who was hiding outside and shot the deputy. And so they were prosecuted in state court for capital murder by a real popular DA over a 3 or 4 county area before a good judge, but a very conservative judge. And I agreed to accept an appointment in the case. I didn't know enough to ask for an investigator. I didn't know enough to ask for a co-counsel. I handled that entire case by myself. Now, luckily, because his two brothers, one of whom was a juvenile who was not tried, but the other brother was an adult, had 2 lawyers. So there were 3 lawyers between the 2 people, and we worked collaboratively. We got a change of venue from Ashland City to Dixon, Tennessee. Started trying to pick a jury in Dixon, Tennessee, and when we found out that a woman had lied about something in order to get on the jury because she wanted to be on this jury because she wanted this vengeance for this police officer. We got a change of venue from there to West Tennessee, tried it in Jackson, Tennessee, before a different judge with a different prosecutor and obviously different jurors, and tried it. My client, in the process of getting ready for trial, told me I didn't kill that officer. Said the reason I said that I did is because the fourth guy who was with us was the one who did it. And as we were driving away from there that night, we drove over the Harpeth River and threw the rifle into the river, and he said, I know where you live and I know where your wife and daughter live. If my name is ever mentioned, if anybody's arrested, my name is mentioned, your wife and daughter ain't gonna be around. So he said, so I said I wasn't gonna, and he did. He had a little daughter about a year and a half old. So he took responsibility for the killing. I had him polygraphed. He passed a polygraph. Tennessee had rewritten the death statute and substantially expanded the kinds of issues a jury would have to consider and the kinds of proof that are available. And so I gave the polygraph results to the DA. I said, you might want to know this, that my client has passed a polygraph saying that so-and-so, who they hadn't arrested, and who was still running around out there, killed that deputy sheriff. Yeah, bullshit. So I got the judge to agree that the polygraph examiner could testify about the polygraph. And he did, and he was a very professional witness, did a very good job, and so they called as a witness the guy that I said confessed to my client, and had him testify. He was a terrible witness. He actually had served time with my client's brother, who had served older brother who had served time. And I cross-examined him, and I was real pleased with having him come out as angry and small-minded and the kind of guy who could lie easily and maybe the kind of guy who could shoot somebody in the back. My client got on the stand and testified, which, of course, he doesn't have to do, and told his story. And when he was talking about his daughter and about how he's afraid for his daughter, tears were coming out his eyes. And he was a young guy. He was 18 or 19 when the shooting took place. He was strung out on heroin that he'd gotten addicted to when his brother shot him up in the funeral home at their father's funeral. And so I'm even getting a little emotional now. He testified to all of that. And he was a good-looking kid. I put on the nurse that treated his daughter, talking about him and how he related to his daughter when he would bring his daughter in. And the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder and gave him a life sentence. And I think it was because of who they saw he was. I don't know whether they believed that he wasn't the shooter or not. I expect some of them probably did, but they didn't have to decide that because he was guilty because he was there participating in a felony murder. And I think his testimony and that nurse's testimony, E.T. was out about that time. And I can't believe I did this. I talked about my client, and I said, you can see in him, like with E.T., you can see that heart inside of him. And he owes a big penalty for what he did do, what he admitted doing, but he doesn't need to die. I don't know, but anyway, that was the theme of the argument. He served his time, made parole, got out. All three, the younger brother, who was a juvenile, was raised by the sheriff, Doris Weekly. Doris Weekly, sheriff of Cheatham County, raised the juvenile.
Wow.
Because he had no family left. I mean, the mother and father both did at this time, and the older brothers were in certain prisons serving life sentences. He got out anyway. My client got out eventually, and moved to Texas and became an over-the-road truck driver. He stopped by to see me one time. He was in town. We had a nice visit. He was getting up to leave, and he said, "You want to know what really happened that night?" I said, "No, I don't think so. I think I'm satisfied with what I believe happened now." He said, okay. Walked out. So I feel real good about that case. I was a fool taking it without the resources that I needed, but I got lucky, and I had a client that had a story to tell that was a compelling story. And I don't think people were as mean-spirited then as they were now.
Yeah.
And this was a country jury, and it was not in this area.
But you said no. I don't want to hear anymore.
Yeah. Partly because I like telling this story, and it's a better story if you really don't know.
Banner and Company is a production of the new Nashville Banner. Our producers are Steve Haruch and Andrea Tudhope. Original music is by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company. I'm going to have you do we do a little final question here, where it's your choice out of that fancy fish bowl.
Uh-oh.
And a previous guest has posed a question, serious, maybe not so serious, and if you'd read it and who it's from.
From Mary Ann McKenzie. How would you like to be
How would you like to be a vegetarian?
Yeah, I sort of am. I mean, I quit eating red meat on January 1, 1985.
Well, you qualify. That's a long
Well, no, but
time.
I still eat chicken and seafood and stuff. So I'm not a vegetarian, but I'm a non-red meat eater.
You feel better?
Yeah, I do. I mean, partly it was an experiment to see. I mean, it was just for a month or so. But I was kind of into staying fit, and I was, I jogged and bicycled and stuff, and tried to cut. The guy at Vanderbilt who wrote the book about fat.
Martin Catan.
Yep, I hadn't eaten butter since that book, and so I was already trying to do some things like that. And I said, maybe red meat's just something I can get along without. Partly wanted to see if I could, because I love barbecue, I love hot dogs, I love a good hamburger. But I want to see if I could do it, because I figured someday I'm going to get to the point where I got to get rid of that. I might have to stop drinking whiskey. I might have to start, changing my diet in other ways. Maybe I'll find out now if I can.